So many great questions. We had to record a second mailbag edition. We're going to be taking your questions about potential trades, roster changes, so much more. All that coming up next here on Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Heat Nation. It's Locked On Heat, your daily podcast covering all things Miami Heat. However you may be listening on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app. Thank you for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm David Ramil, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Wes Goldberg. So many great questions. Again, we recorded a mailbag episode. Make sure you check out part one if you haven't already. We took some great questions about Victor Oladipo, Jimmy's return, and things of that sort. So much to get to. We'll address some of those things in this episode as well, including some talk about potential trades for superstars around the league. We'll see what Miami's able to do. But again, so many great questions. Thanks to all of you who support the show, and we're able to send those in via email, via Twitter, via YouTube, etc. So let's just get right into it. This first question comes into us from Dan Healy. He's the host over at the Miami Heat UK podcast. If you haven't checked out what Dan and his
from across the pond.
Absolutely. I don't know what that was, but yes, great show. Fantastic show. Dan is a great friend. He's a great guy. He loves his Heat team. I mean, listen, for all of us that think we're great fans or whatever, great media members, etc. For Dan to be able to stay up till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to watch some terrible game in Sacramento, nobody goes through more than he does. So anyway, that's my shout out to Dan, a great guy and a great host. His question is, overall, from your expectation to the level of output that we've seen so far, who's impressed you most this season out of Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, or Caleb Martin? And can we expect to see meaningful playoff minutes for any of them if the team is fully healthy? Let's start off with that. What were your expectations for Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, or Caleb Martin at the start of the season?
Some filler minutes here and there. Just injuries happen throughout the course of the season. Hopefully just come in and don't break anything. That was basically my expectations. Maybe you get some sort of development from Caleb Martin on a 2-way contract, as is the purpose of that spot on the roster. Gabe Vincent, we saw some things last year. The big question about him is, does that 3-point shot ever come around? That was sort of the thing that you're watching coming into the season. Yeah. Max Strus, you're like, all right, just hit threes, and just do that, Max. And for the most part, he has. Those are my expectations. All three of them, you should say have just blown all those expectations out of the water.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They've become core parts of this rotation. They weren't supposed to be. A lot of it is because of injury, but here we are. They're core members of this rotation. And it's creating some issues going forward for Miami. A good problem to have as far as trying to figure out how you play these guys when everybody is healthy. But that's what's going on. As far as who's been the most impressive, I mean, just looking at Gabe Vincent, 7.3 points per game on 45% shooting, 39% from three for the season, 1.7 rebounds, 2.6 assists. It's a good stat line for a guy you didn't think was going to get playing time. Caleb Martin, 7.6 points per game, 49% shooting, 38% from three. Very similar scoring numbers to Gabe Vincent, three rebounds and an assist. I would put it between those two guys. Nothing against Max Strus. I just think he's just sort of been what we thought he was going to be, where Gabe Vincent and Caleb Martin are exceeding those expectations. It's sort of like, it's not really against Max Strus. I think it's just more speaking to, what this performance is versus those initial expectations.
Remember, he had that big showing in Summer League too, where he was knocking down game winners, and everybody thought, "Oh, okay, this is it. He's the next coming of Duncan." You've got Duncan, and if for some reason Duncan doesn't pan out, or you trade Duncan, Max is going to step in and do everything that Duncan does. That hasn't quite been the case. They're two completely different players. I remember doing this even a couple of years ago with Kelly Olynyk and Myers Leonard, and everybody's like, "Oh, you've got 2 7-footers. Both happen to be white. Both can stretch a floor. They're identical players." They're not. They play different games. It's the same thing with Duncan and Max. They're not the same. They don't have the same game at all. Luckily, they can both shoot. I would say one is a shooter. The other is a guy who can shoot and does other things, or is supposed to. And I think that's part of the concern, especially when you're looking at players and living up to the expectations. I'd say that Max has been somewhat, not necessarily a disappointment, because that feels kind of harsh, but I mean, I think you said it pretty well. He's been who we thought he was, a guy who can go out there, fill some minutes, do some things on occasion. He's had some nice moments, fantastic, but he's just not a guy that you're going to rely on. And that's where you are with this roster, is that sometimes you need a guy like Max or somebody else in this roster to step up. And that's just not who they are when the context of the NBA. They're 13th, 14th guys on rosters.
Yeah.
That's not who you're supposed to be on your star to carry you through for a big win on a night-to-night basis. So,
and I would say out of those three,
yeah.
Strus is the worst defensively, for whatever that's worth. I mean, he's the best three-point
Yes.
shooter, but
Yes.
Those other guys have proven to be pretty good three-point shooters.
Right.
And both of them are very good defensively. Between those two, I think you and I are on the same page here as far as narrowing it down into Gabe or Caleb. You got to pick one. Who do you pick?
To me, it's Caleb. I was pretty high on him, actually. I think when the announcement came that he was signed, I was like, you know what? This guy feels like he can embrace this culture. We've seen that before. I mean, this might be a weird thing to bring up, a correlation here, but when you split up twins, sometimes they all kind of pursue their own individual journey, different path. And a guy like him who was cut by Charlotte, he's like basically trying to prove that he can still be an NBA player. He's been given this opportunity. You know that Miami's development is second to none, that they're going to be able to maximize players. And that's the thing that has always stood out. I remember first having these thoughts when it came to the San Antonio Spurs, when I did a feature years ago on David Lee, a guy that was basically washed up, unfortunately, within the parlance of the league. And yet he went in and was very, very productive. And I remember thinking to myself, why is it that he's able to thrive in San Antonio? It's because they were able to fine-tune what he does well and focus on that, erase his mistakes and whatever liabilities and deficiencies he might have. Miami has been able to do that as consistently as anybody. You look at San Antonio, you look at Miami, you look at Toronto. Those are the teams that have those kind of development systems in place where they can take any player and focus on their strengths. And you look at a guy like Caleb. He's athletic. He's got great effort. He's always willing to do whatever it takes defensively. You combine all those things with some occasional shooting from him, and you're going to get a really, really solid player. And that's where we've gone. So Gabe is fantastic. He's been a really, really nice find, a nice addition, but he's already been here for 3 years. I think the expectations were so low with Caleb Martin that all of a sudden when we see him have a 28-point career night, that's all of a sudden you go, wait, this is a really good NBA player potentially. And I think that's why he is the one who has exceeded expectations by far the most.
I agree. I mean, just based that he was on a two-way contract and Gabe Vincent was actually on the roster, it's got to be Caleb Martin. But hey, good on the Heat. They found two dudes in Gabe Vincent and Caleb Martin. Those guys have proven to be important. They will be.
All right, let's move on with another question here. This one comes in from Narayanan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I apologize. But he writes in, interesting dichotomy the team is facing without Bam and Jimmy. Dedmon, Gabe, Caleb, Max, Yurt, and KZ are gaining some valuable experience playing important and extended minutes, absolutely, which is bound to help the team in the long/stretch run. The overuse of vets like PJ and Kyle has to be concerning. Question number one, could the upcoming string of games against sub-500 teams warrant some rest for the likes of Kyle and PJ, or should they wait until Jimmy and Tyler are back from their setbacks? I've got question number two that we'll answer later on, but let's get to question number one first. Go ahead.
No, you can't rest anybody right now, Kyle or anybody else. You've got 10 players available. You start resting guys, now you're down to very close to the minimum of what you're allowed as far as an active roster is concerned. I think when Jimmy and Tyler and eventually Bam do return, Kyle Lowry and PJ Tucker have earned some rest, and Markieff Morris, I should say, when he gets back. When PJ and Kyle have earned some rest, you tell them that they're resting. Like, you be the coach that says, hey, you're not playing tonight. I think it's something that they probably should try to convince them of, but it won't be until that point at the very least.
Yeah, and we've seen this consistently from Miami and from Spo. He's always been very determined. He says, you know what, this is just the challenge of playing in this league. You got to step up. You got to find somebody who can, play these extended minutes, etc. We're going through it. Everybody's going through it. You got to find a way. These guys want to handle that. They want to accept that responsibility, etc. I think it is going to be really difficult to tell PJ Tucker, no, sit down. You need more rest. I'd like for him to be able to do that. He needs the kind of rest because, again, there's a bigger picture here where both he and Kyle need to be able to sit out some extended time so they can be thriving in the playoffs, which is where it matters the most. But that's going to be next to impossible. And yes, to your original point, I think it's just unlikely. I don't see Spo going to these guys and saying, no, take today off. We're going up against Detroit. I can't see that going over well with either of those two players. But moreover, I just don't see Spo doing that in the first place. But let's get to question number two. What are you hearing about Jimmy's injury and his possible return? Wes, I'll turn this one over to you because you covered Steph Curry when he was going through a similar tailbone injury, and it's a difficult injury to come back through. So go ahead, give us your 2 cents on that.
Eerily similar kind of situations too between Steph and Jimmy, because Steph also came back and re-aggravated the tailbone injury and had to miss more time. So This is just something that happens with guys that are constantly getting to the basket the way that Jimmy and Steph are, and putting themselves in position to get fouled and take hard falls and potentially re-injure that tailbone. As far as what we're hearing,
Not much.
I'm not hearing anything. I just know, but I know that this injury is very much a pain tolerance thing, right? Like it's a contusion. This isn't a fracture. This isn't a break. This isn't something that requires surgery. This is pain tolerance. And when we saw Jimmy come back, he was very visibly limping down the floor, was not himself. We talked about it in that recap of that game. It's all about that, monitoring him and in warm-ups and in shoot-arounds and in practice and stuff like that, and just basically asking Jimmy, hey, how you feeling today? You ready to go? I do think that the Heat will take a very cautionary approach this time, as opposed to, not saying that they didn't do it last time, the first time Jimmy came back from that, but it'll probably just be even more so this time around.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, look, that's the whole nature of it. Like, maybe it's just a sign of my getting older or something like that, but I watch these games and these guys take some ridiculous falls sometimes where you wonder, how the hell do they even get up, much less how do they play 40 minutes a game and do everything that Jimmy does? Like, it's just so important for him to be able to stay healthy. And so I think they're going to let him get back to as close to 100% as possible before they.
That's a really good point too that you just made. It's like, of anybody on this roster, you probably need Jimmy Butler at 100% health more than anybody else on this team, right? Because of the way that he plays. Because like we talked about in part 1 of this episode, if you're going to go through Brooklyn and Milwaukee to get out of the Eastern Conference, we said you need a bubble performance to get back to the finals from Jimmy. He doesn't do that with a lingering tailbone issue, right? He only does that at as close to 100% health as possible.
Right. Yeah. So he's got to come back. He's going to take a hard fall at some point. You hope that by then the injury has gotten as close to 100% so it can heal, so that he can withstand those kind of great impacts and be able to play through it, because that's, like you said, it's all about tolerance for pain. You're going to deal with it at some point, and hopefully he's just not going to be able to take so much pain that he's just trying to force his way onto the floor, etc. So we'll see. Hopefully he'll return soon. I think it'll probably be at some point during this stretch where they're back at home for Jimmy to come back. He didn't travel with the team, so he's going to be out at least the next 2 games. I would imagine I'd say probably in about a week or 2 as of this recording. But we'll move on. This last question comes in from our pal Pete. He always writes in great questions. We love his suggestions. This one is, do you think Miami will entertain trades this season? And if so, what is your opinion on how much salary will get swapped across our table? I think our potential targets include Miles Turner, Jeremy Grant, who the Athletic is reporting is now available from the Detroit Pistons, and Harrison Barnes of the sinking ship known as the Sacramento Kings. Can they even be a sinking ship when they've been sunk for 2 decades? I don't know. That's a good question.
Point. Yeah, I don't know. No, you just become that deteriorated ship where they start finding like skeletons and stuff on like years and years and years from now.
Remember
like
when you were
the
covering
skull
games?
Of Luke Walton will come up like 2 years from now.
No, thanks. Remember when you were covering games in what was it, the Golden One Center? Is that what they were called? There was so much
best arena in the NBA.
Yeah, so much enthusiasm, right? This incredible arena. We saved the team. We brought them back to Sacramento. We're going to turn it around. Not quite. Same futility, different, just outside facade. It's all the same.
Best oatmeal raisin cookie I've ever had, and best dessert in media dining in the NBA. Just saying.
All right. I'll take your word for it. I've never been.
It's worth a trip to. I have not either. This one it transcends oatmeal raisin.
It made you a believer, huh? The oatmeal raisin
just cookies? In that one. I'm not going out buying oatmeal raisin cookies at Publix or anything. Like, that's not my style. But when I am in Sacramento, I make sure to get one there. As far as the question here, Miles Turner is not going to happen. Jeremy Grant is not going to happen. Harrison Barnes is not going to happen. It's nearly impossible to make those salaries work. The only way to make it work is to trade Duncan Robinson. I don't think that the Heat are unwilling to do that for somebody of that caliber, but those guys aren't also. Duncan Robinson is so essential to the way that the starting 5 functions from a shooter's standpoint. And then let's just say you put in Harrison Barnes or Jeremy Grant. Like, where are they playing? How are they helping space the floor for Jimmy and Bam? It's just not. It doesn't really work. I think there's diminishing returns in a deal like that. I understand it's a big name. Obviously, somebody like Jeremy Grant and Harrison Barnes is a better player in a vacuum than Duncan Robinson is, but fit at some point does matter. And Duncan Robinson is very much a ceiling raiser for this Heat team and the way that this roster is constructed. So that said, there's no other way to kind of get to those salaries. I do think that Pat Riley will entertain trades for whatever that is worth. I think he'll hear things. I think that this team should be out there scanning the league for cheap wings, veteran wings, and maybe a cheap big man somewhere, that so that you don't fall into this situation again if Bam or Dwayne gets hurt, that you're relying on small ball KZ Okpala or Omer Yurtseven, who's so up and down right now. I could see them going in that direction. Maybe swapping somebody like KZ or Yurtseven in a deal like that, or even maybe a Markieff Morris if this thing is lingering and they're able to swap him for something. I don't know. But that's sort of where I'm looking at right now, if there's any trade available. I do know this. The last time the Heat were in this position as sort of a fringe team with finals aspirations, they swung a deal for Jay Crowder and Andre Iguodala, which ended up mattering quite a bit in the bubble and their playoff run to the finals. I think Pat Riley is very much interested in doing that. As far as how much salary you could take back, not much.
Okay, my caveat to that, and you're as aware of this as anybody, is that they were able to swing that deal because you basically had 3 players on the team on the roster at that point in time that were either unplayable or had burned bridges, or those bridges were now in smoldering embers, and they no longer were part of the long-term vision of this team. Dion Waiters, James Johnson, and of course Justice Winslow, who was hurt, not likely to come back, spent another season nursing injuries, etc., and is only now a shell of the player that he was in Miami, as we've seen so unfortunately often throughout the case in Miami Heat history. So I think that made any kind of deal for Andre Iguodala, Solomon Hill. Shout out to Solomon Hill, by the way, who is
never gets mentioned.
Yeah, we never mentioned that. But also he's got a season-ending injury, so we only hope he comes back at some point. But and this, of course, Jay Crowder, who was a monumental piece in Miami's success in the Orlando bubble, able to transform the roster. But you look at this roster right now, and there's nobody who's really unplayable, with the exception of UD, that's not going anywhere. Yes, you've had to rely on Caleb, Max, Gabe, etc. Yurtseven's been getting minutes now. Markieff at some point is going to come back, and those guys, maybe they'll be unplayable at some point, but their salaries are so low that I just don't see any kind.
You can't do anything. Even if you were to package, you put Markieff, KZ, and Omer Yurtseven together. Let's just in a package for that. That's only netting you like a $6 million player. And a $6 million player is not worth a 3-for-1. And then you got to fill out the rest of your roster, and you're still. And this is a team that is not motivated apparently to cross the luxury tax threshold that you're only $400,000 away from. So I just don't see that. Like that's the part about a deal, that any deal to get done almost has to be a 1-for-1 or a 2-for-2, an even amount of players swap. And to your point, they don't have those like middle class salaries to move in a deal. The only one they have really is PJ Tucker at $7 million, and they're not moving him. They're good luck finding better value at $7 million than PJ Tucker right now.
Wasn't that Pat Riley's point years ago when you and I were still covering the team, and he was talking about the deals for Olynyk, Johnson, etc.? It's like those deals look bad, but they're not. They're movable deals, and they were. All those players were traded because they were eminently movable deals. You don't have those. You either got somebody getting paid $25 million or more, like Duncan, Kyle, Jimmy, Bam, etc., or you've got guys making a couple million, etc. That those contracts aren't movable, or you're trading ketchup packets for a barbecue dipping sauce. It's not. You're not getting a main meal. You're not getting a main course. You're just getting a side, I don't know, condiment. You're not getting anything that's going to be important or essential to Miami making a deep playoff run. And you can only packet so much of those packets together in order to get something of value. And I don't know that those players exist. If you're a guy on an X team who's getting paid $6-7 million and is a great value, why the hell would you trade him for the potential development of an Omer Yurtseven? I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think. What's the name of the guy who was in with Denver? Tory Craig, right? He's now with the Indiana Pacers. They're looking to move him too. I'm not sure what his deal is. That seems like the kind of player that maybe is a wing defender, a guy who's played in big moments. He was with the Suns and the Bucks last year on their run to the finals. I don't know.
Yeah, could you do like that's what we're talking about. Could you do like Markieff Morris's expiring contract for Tory Craig? And the motivation for Indiana to do that would be, well, Markieff is on an expiring deal. I think they signed Tory Craig to like a 2-year deal, so we get the money off the books, and then Miami could just throw the $500,000 of cash or whatever it is that they can do at the Pacers, who are going probably to hit this rebuild button and miss any playoff revenue this year, which they rely on as a small market team. So hey, here's some extra cash. Here's Markieff Morris is expiring. We'll take Tory Craig. It's something very minor like that. It's not something that's going to super excite Heat fans like Miles Turner or Jeremy Grant or Harrison
He
Barnes.
signed a 2-year, $10 million deal. So he's owed 5.1 next season, 4.8, 4.9 basically this season. So that's the kind of player that you're looking to get. As you're looking at Tory Craig, just given his experience and the fact that he's a somewhat of a name around NBA circles, is he that much of a drastic improvement over somebody? I mean,
No,
I know we keep
I
talking.
thought he was making like $2 million. So even that, man, that now you're talking about another 2-for-1, and the Heat just don't have the money to do it. They're not going to do
Right.
that.
Would you rather give up, the potential from what we've seen over the last few weeks of KZ Okpala and Max Strus's relatively cheap deal and the fact that he's a much better shooter than Tory Craig is in exchange for a couple months rental of Tory Craig? I don't know. That's worth it.
I don't. Maybe if you're not getting anything from Markieff Morris, right, with this lingering whiplash thing, and we did have a doctor tell us, on the show that he should be starting the process of getting back on the court relatively soon, based on a normal timeline for whiplash, but that's not a specific somebody that has been dealing with Markieff's injury specifically. But if you feel like you're not going to get anything from Markieff and it's like trade deadline time and you're still not getting anything from him and this thing is lingering, then I would consider Markieff and KZ for Tory Craig. And then I'm not exactly sure on the finances there, but you could still promote Caleb Martin on onto that 14th roster spot in that instance, because you're doing a 2-for-1 instead of the 15th roster spot, and still potentially stay under the luxury tax. Maybe the Heat do some gymnastics that way in order to kind of quote unquote upgrade a spot on the roster. But I mean, Tory Craig, really? Like, is that really? Are we going to go through all those hoops for Tory Craig? I don't know.
Yeah. And I just found this out right now. I never would have guessed this in a million years. He's 30 plus years old. Like he's midway through his 30th year right now. So he's only
this is
been
a lot
4
of
years
Tory Craig. This is a lot of Tory Craig talk.
Well, that's the kind of player Miami might be potentially targeting. So unfortunately, I just don't think Miami's in a position right now. Like give it to the offseason where they can assess just how far they made it this year, whether or not they do have to move a Duncan Robinson, whether or not they do have to make Tyler Herro a starter, whether or not they have to entertain offers for Kyle Lowry, etc. That's when the magic happens during the
offseason
right now.
Yeah,
exactly. I just don't see them doing any kind of significant changes this season. Their hands are somewhat tied at this point. And you know what? It's okay. They've got a really surprisingly good deep roster. Yeah. Let's not try to get rid of this or blow up this team for anything. And we'd love to be able to acquire a Jay Crowder or an Andre Iguodala if those guys are available. But you just don't have those contracts on the roster right now. You don't have 3 guys making between $8 and $12 million that you can package for $30 million worth of incoming salary. You just don't have that on this team right now. You've got guys making 30, or you got guys making 2 or 3, not enough to get that kind of great player right there somewhere in the middle. You're not moving PJ Tucker because, hell, he's been Miami's best player over the last few weeks. But anyway, that'll do it for this part 2 of the mailbag. Again, thank you so much to everybody who sent in questions. Keep those coming in all season long. We'll be doing those periodically throughout the rest of the year. Thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm David Ramil, signing off for now. Thanks for joining me, Wes.
Have a great weekend, everybody.